then I mentioned when we went through this before, that's the toughest call you would ever have to make. But it's still not that hard. Which salivary tissue, thinking about the progression, does that have to be? All serous? Or is that a lot of mucus? Or a tiny bit of mucus? Yeah, that's a lot of mucus. At least half is mucus, which makes it sublingual for sure. Submandibular would have to have far, far less mucous cell cluster. But, you know, it's not as dominant as it was in the previous slide for sublingual. All right. On to the layers of the GI tract wall. These you absolutely have to know for consistent wall structure. And then it starts in the esophagus, where you have a layer from the luminal side with this bluish reddish zone. It goes all the way down to where it lightens up, right here. There's the mucosa, here to here. First layer mucosa. And then where it lightens up, looser connective tissue, submucosa. Most noted for these large openings that you find in it. These are the blood vessels that we mentioned, particularly when you get erosions and now bleeding starts to become obvious. Then you know you're down into the submucosa. It's eroded all the way down into that leg. And then the third, right here, much more dense than the others, muscle, the greatest complement of smooth muscle in human construction, muscularis externa. And you have to put on externa. You can't just go with muscularis because there's another one, mentioned it in a moment, but it's up in here. So you have to have two words. Yes, even sometimes on the exam I'll even say, gotta go with two words. Can't leave it at one to get full credit. Muscularis externa. May ask, well, what is the grain of this layer? Circular. And this layer? Longitudinal. Yep. Some would say lengthwise, which would be fine. And then for lecture, really important is what controls it. Actually sandwiched in between, which is not testable. You recall staying off that flat line, R-box for sure. That's the control of the muscularis externa. Or myenteric if you go descriptive. And then the fourth layer always, now you call it serosa, the serrate wrap layer. All right? And I would ask you about the layering in esophagus, and then save other questions for the other compartments. But it still applies to the stomach and intestines as well. Then you have to be able to identify the compartment of esophagus. And the way you do that is to see this first layer, which I will always have far more magnified, 200 times, so you could really see it as this purple zone. Purple, and sometimes it's more reddish. But it's just a multicellular layering up here, stratified squamous. And once you see that, it's got to be esophagus. But we'll go through other slides in the pre-exam to also subtract structures. No pits, no villi, other things that you see are not there That would also lead you to know that it's got to be esophagus. But the quickest way, just that first multicellular layer. That's the only place we're picking up on that kind of epithelium. And then under the epithelium layer, you always have this spongy layer. It's part of the mucosa. Lamina propria, loose connective tissue. And then mixed in, you'll find little fiber bundles of muscles. Just little clumps. Now this is muscularis mucosae. And I would describe it as just little bundles of muscle in the mucosa. I might ask, well, this is very important to the process of peristalsis. True or false? False. It has nothing to do with peristalsis. It's actually too delicate. Peristalsis is over here, part of the muscularis externa. This just sort of ripples the mucosa a little bit. Also squeezes on these ducts. And you can now get this mucus secretion out on the surface. Helps to lubricate the esophagus. And this is just accessory salivary tissue, just little clumps of mucus cells in the wall of your esophagus. Some even give them the name esophageal glands. Just mucus cells. As I say, you've already done everything you need to on mucus cells with salivary tissue. All right, that's all I want you to do for identification of the esophagus for its histology.